Welcome. I'm Leslie Canham.
I'm Mary Gavoni.
I'm Linda Harvey.
I'm Olivia Wan, and together we are the Compliance Divas.
Hello, and welcome to the Compliance Divas podcast. I'm Mary Gavoni, and I will be your moderator for today. Today's topic is onboarding employees, why this is so important for dental practices and many times an overlooked protocol or procedure in a practice. We bring clarity and simplicity to compliance by navigating regulatory compliance to keep you on course. You can subscribe to the Compliance Divas podcast through your favorite podcast channel or on our website, thecompliancedivas.com. Any resources that we mention in today's podcast will be found or can be found on the Compliance Divas website, thecompliancedivas.com. If you have questions regarding the podcast, you can submit them to support@compliancedivas.com. We realize that many practices are facing staffing shortages and a lot of overturning of staff now because of the pandemic and availability of employees, which makes onboarding all that more important for bringing in new employees into the practice. Many people view onboarding as an orientation into the practice, but really onboarding, according to the Society for Human Resource Management, is a very long, detailed process. So SHRM, as the organization is called, defines onboarding as processes in which new hires are integrated into the organization. It includes activities that allow new employees to complete an initial new hire orientation process, as well as learn about the organization or the practice and its structure, culture, vision, mission, and values. For some organizations, the onboarding process consists of 1 or 2 days of activities. For other organizations, the process may involve a series of activities spanning 1 or many months. I think ours in dentistry is probably condensed way down to probably a day or maybe even a half a day for orientation. But according to the Society for Human Resources Management, onboarding is often confused with orientation. So one of the things that we're going to try to do is help our listeners understand the differences. So while orientation is necessary for completing paperwork according to SHRM and other routine tasks, onboarding is a comprehensive process involving management and other employees that could last up to 12 months. And we hope that that employee stays on board for 12 months or more. So Olivia, can you discuss for us from an employment law perspective, what are some key elements of the orientation process for employees, such as forms and TB testing and so forth?
Sure, Mary. I think you defined it well, that it is a process and it is a bit time consuming. And I want to emphasize first that the employee is paid for their time in completing this process. So it's not like we send home a stack of forms and expect them to fill it out on their time. So let's start with some of the government required documents that they must complete. So an hourly employee, even salary, would complete a W-4. Also, we need to have clearance, whether we fill it out online or use an I-9 form, verifying that they are a citizen or legal alien. Also, if it's a licensed employee, we need to verify that the license is current. One of my clients, when I suggested this, he reviewed online the license of one of the dental assistants, and she was not licensed. So that came as a surprise. So having completed that process, identified that problem. Also, there is the importance of conducting a background check. Now, Mary, if I may, I'd like to give the example of Tennessee. According to tn.gov, on the healthcare professionals website, background checks are required to provide patient care. So before any person who will be providing direct patient care is hired, for whom a background check has not been completed, healthcare facilities, emergency medical services, and individual health professionals are required by law to conduct background checks using the state sex offenders registry, the state abuse registry, and the abuse registries for states in which the prospective employee has lived in the previous 7 years. And Tennessee provides links for these registries. Now, most of our clients just assume to let us handle their background check because they don't want to go to the different states employees have lived in, and they have a document to keep on file. So that's a very, very important component of bringing someone on board. Now, let's say that it's an admin employee who is not licensed as a dental assistant or hygienist. It's still important, Mary, to do a background check, because if the individual who is hired to work at the front desk or for admin services, they have access to identifiable information. And if this person that we've hired has previously stolen someone's identity or is a criminal that relates to fraud, then the dentist or the employer could be guilty of negligent hiring. So these are very important processes to verify. And also, Mary, I want to emphasize how important it is to allow the new hire to read the employer's handbook. And reading the handbook takes place on employer time. So they're compensated for their time to read the handbook. If you have a handbook. So the handbook is certainly a way to introduce the new employee to the policies of the practice and how different matters are handled. Now, when the employee completes the review of the handbook, they would sign acknowledgement of receipt of the handbook. So that is a key thing to do, because if there is a termination later on, or if for example, if the employee files for unemployment, the state might ask, well, how did the employee know that that was the expectation or the employer's policy? And then you could produce this document showing that the employee acknowledged it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they agree, but they're acknowledging those policies that are in place. So another thing that I would mention, Mary, before I turn it back over to you, is providing the employee with a job description. So even though it may be a dental assistant or a dental hygienist who's very familiar with their job role as a clinical team member, it's important that they have a job description that discusses their primary role as well as their secondary role, which might involve something that's not directly related to their primary role, such as serving as a safety coordinator or the HIPAA privacy officer. So I think that's important. And also making sure that we use a job application. So many dental offices hire people off of a resume. The job application is an important form to use because it usually has an area on the form to give the employer permission to do the reference check. And during one of the sessions I had with one of my law clients was actually a dental practice where the dental board was conducting an investigation. They actually asked for a copy of the job application, and the dental office didn't have one. And they said, well, we just used a resume. So I thought it was interesting that the board specifically asked for a copy of the application. So it is a process, and to keep from forgetting something, we suggest that you put together a checklist. And Mary, I would not mind sharing the checklist that I use for an onboarding, and maybe some of the other divas have them as well. But I'll be happy to share that, and check with the individual state to see if there are additional instructions. We know that CDC does recommend TB skin test. That is so often overlooked, our TB skin test. I know Leslie will talk to us more about the OSHA component, but I would say, Mary, those are some of the key things that I would hit on.
Thank you, Olivia. That is great information. It probably sounds a little daunting right now to employers or employees of all these things that need to be done. However, that helps to ensure a better employment experience and hopefully resulting in a more long-term employee if we bring them on board in the right way. But I always joke about how, we hire somebody on a Friday and they start on Monday, and we just throw them to the wolves and then clean up the mess when things don't go as well. But it is important, as Olivia stated, to note that the CDC recommends that all employees, new employees, be screened for TB. And if they have a positive TB test, then they cannot start work until they are cleared by a local health department. And there are no other states that I'm aware of at this point, but you should check with your state health department to see if there are any kind of annual requirements in dental practices. There are in other healthcare settings. So Leslie, can you talk to us a little bit about what does OSHA say as far as onboarding employees? What kind of training is required and what kind of documentation do we need?
Well, Mary, I think we covered a lot of the important points about OSHA training. Is that we've already said that it has to take place before people are placed at risk. It has to take place during regular working hours. So someone can't just take the OSHA manual home with them and read it the day before they start working and then say they're qualified for that. And it has to be on the clock and paid, time paid. And the training has to be at initial assignment. So before someone sees a patient, before they process instruments or clear a treatment room or work with bloodborne pathogens or chemicals, they need training. And so many times I see this step skipped. As you said, start interview on Friday and start on Monday. And we haven't had a chance to really bring someone up to speed on our practice policies and procedures, answer any questions. And so someone is just, it's like they're building the plane while they're flying it, trying to figure out all the nuances of our practice. So employers must also provide additional training when modification of tasks or procedures or institution of new tasks or procedures are introduced. And I think it was a very good point that was made earlier, that we are hiring people right and left that maybe have no experience in dentistry and trying to train them on the job. But we're also taking people who don't have clinical experience, maybe somebody at the front office that says, well, I can help out. Tell me what to do. I'll go, run some instruments for you or clear a treatment room. So we need to make sure that everyone is up to speed. And when it comes to bloodborne pathogen training, that's pretty important because we're dealing with human pathogens that could cause serious illness, and we don't want anybody to be harmed as a result of working in dentistry. But there's also another type of training that's so important, is the hazard communication training, because we do work with chemicals in a dental setting. Granted, there's less chemicals than there were 50 years ago. We're not using as much cold sterile or photochemical solutions, and our disinfectants many times are very environmental and user friendly and not carrying serious health hazards. But we still need to be acquainted with how to read a safety data sheet and how to understand what the label elements are. And so this information, it doesn't get absorbed all in one day. I like to say that when someone is hired, we've got to give them at least a couple of days to get acquainted with our procedures and policies and what to do. For example, if there's an exposure incident, where's the first aid kit? Who do I report to if I have a needle stick? Things like that. Eyewash station, a little information on how to run that eyewash station before it's actually needed. So these are the important parts of the onboarding process, to have that OSHA bloodborne pathogen training and hazard communication training. And if someone has had bloodborne pathogen training within the last 12 months, that could qualify. Many times we do have people that, for example, hygienists that work in multiple practices. Certainly their bloodborne pathogen training doesn't need to be repeated, but an introduction to your practice, to where things are located, the first aid kit, the fire extinguisher, where's the red bag if we have a blood spill, who do I report to if I have an accident? All of those things are important, and they vary greatly from practice to practice. So it is important to do those things. And then OSHA says bloodborne pathogen training has to be conducted at least initially, and then annually thereafter. Of course, when changes are there's task changes or new tasks that are modified tasks, then it has to take place right away. But it might surprise our listeners to know that an OSHA safety officer could walk into your practice today and say, I want to see the last 3 years of bloodborne pathogen training documentation for your employees. If they're your employees for the last 3 years and you haven't done bloodborne pathogen training, it's pretty difficult to produce that documentation, Mary.
Absolutely. And Leslie, can you also address if there's any documentation needed for hepatitis B vaccinations?
Absolutely. So employers are required to offer the hepatitis B vaccination to all clinical employees within 10 days of employment. Now, that's a requirement. It doesn't matter if people have been getting vaccinations for the last 40 years of hepatitis B. We can't just assume that someone doesn't need it because they worked in another dental practice. We have to offer it, and it's either offered or declined. And if it's offered, of course, the employer is responsible for the cost of paying for the vaccination series and the testing, the post-vaccination testing. So that would become documentation that could be retained. But what if it's declined for whatever reason? Employees must sign a declination form. It's actually part of the bloodborne pathogen standard. It's the addendum to the bloodborne pathogen standard in the exact wording. And it really says, Mary, that someone can decline the hepatitis B vaccination, but they can also change their mind later, and the employer still has to pay for it and pay for the post-vaccination testing. And I think that that document is so important for people to sign. Even if I work for an employer, say that I've already been vaccinated for hepatitis B, but if I can't locate my documentation of immunity, then I need to sign that declination form to prove that the employer offered it and it was declined by me.
Excellent. Thank you, Leslie. The other type of training in onboarding protocol that needs to be done, of course, in a dental practice is regarding HIPAA, both the privacy and the security requirements for HIPAA. So all employees should have initial training in the practice, unless, as Leslie said, with regard to the OSHA training, if they've had it within the last year and you can reasonably assume that they have a good understanding of HIPAA, then you might be able to have an abbreviated training with a new employee. But certainly, what are the protocols, the privacy and the security protocols that you follow in your practice? And once that employee has completed training, then we would recommend that you have some documentation, not only of the training, but an agreement from the employees signing a statement saying that they will follow the privacy and security protocols in the practice, that they will appropriately use the internet in the practice, and that they will assure the confidentiality of patient information. Those are critical issues, so that if there is a breach on the part of the employee, then at least you have some way to prove that that employee was informed, they knew what they were supposed to do, but yet they violated those protocols. I'd like to ask Olivia at this point, from a legal standpoint, since you are our legal diva, is there anything else from the HIPAA training requirement or documentation requirement that you might add to that?
Mary, I think you touched on it well, having the confidentiality agreements and computer usage agreements. And I think it ties back to the background checks once again, because if an employee stole the identity of a patient, remember, HIPAA does not give someone a private cause of action. But in the case of someone having damages, so if their identity was stolen, that's a private cause of action against the employee who stole their identity, which means they could also go after the employer for negligent hiring. So I think it pieces together very well.
It does, and thank you for that clarification. And Olivia, we're going to sort of finish up with you with an explanation of how do we keep these records? What is the difference between a personnel file for an employee and what I call a confidential medical file, and why the two can't be, that the two types of information can't be in the same file or file folder?
Sure, Mary. So for one thing, the I-9s, which is the employment eligibility verification, that form is used to verify the identity and employment authorization of individuals hired for employment in the United States. We suggest that those forms be maintained in a confidential, could be electronic, password protected file, or if you're using still paper records, it must be under lock and key. We suggest keeping those separate because if you are audited with your I-9s, if they're all in with the personnel records, then you have a government official looking at everything that they don't need to be looking at. They need to just look at employment eligibility. Second, the medical record, as you pointed out, may not necessarily be stored with the personnel record. And let me clarify that. Let's say in a small dental office, the dental hygienist or the dental assistant is the safety coordinator or the safety manager. And if that's the case, then the medical record should be retained separately because the dental hygienist or dental assistant should not have the authority to look at a personnel record, which contains discipline statements, other documentation that's not relevant to the safety manager. So it'd be separate folders. Now, if the office manager and the safety manager is one and the same person, then you may be able to store them together, but we typically suggest putting them in separate folders. And when I'm working with a client, I will show them how to set these folders up electronically and password protect them and demonstrate how to share them so that if it's a clinical team member managing safety, they would only have authorization to access copies of medical record, such as what Leslie talked about, verification of the Hep B vaccine or a declination statement and whatnot. So those are just a couple of suggestions on how to store it. I am a proponent of electronic record keeping because I think it's much, much easier and less daunting than keeping up with paper files. The important thing is to make sure when you upgrade your system that those files are properly maintained. And with things like Dropbox and other types of programs out there, it makes the process really super easy.
You are exactly right, Olivia. It does make it much easier electronically. Now, one of the questions I just received last week when I was doing a webinar is, does OSHA and does HIPAA accept electronic documentation, or what about our Department of Labor for a state? And they do accept electronic documentation, and it does make it so much easier. Your employee manual, your employment files, and all those, as Olivia stated, can be stored in secured, password protected folders. You can put them on your server so that they're part of the backup of your system so that you don't lose that data in case there's an issue with your system. So is there anything else, Leslie or Olivia, that you would like to add today as we wrap up this episode on onboarding employees? Olivia.
I would suggest that the person that's in management that is responsible for this allocate the time to handle the process. And also remember, it's going to take the employee time to go move through this process as well. So even though we want to hit the door running with patient care, we have to make sure we're allowing enough time to complete the process so that it's not left undone, because that's a common complaint that I hear from management.
It's important to save time in your schedule for the person that you hire to go through this onboarding process and not be in too big of a hurry. I know that when we hire someone, it isn't because we don't need someone with boots on the ground. We need them, and we need them yesterday. But especially when it comes to their safety, we want to make sure that we don't rush through the process. So day one of hire is actually day 1 and 2 of onboarding.
Thank you, Leslie. That's a great way to sum this up. So we thank you for your attention to this podcast. Thank you for joining us. We bring clarity and simplicity to compliance by navigating regulatory compliance to keep you on course. As always, you can submit questions by email to support@thecompliancedivas.com. We will have all of the resources that we mentioned today, all the forms, and thank you, Olivia, very much for offering your checklist for new employees. We will have those available in the resources section of the Compliance Divas website. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time.